Hello, Aaron. You're with me, right?
I am. Hello, Nat. How are you? Good to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you for taking some time to be with us. I think this is a very special documentary that we're presenting virtually at Coral Gables Art Cinema. It was completed, obviously, before we were hit by the pandemic, but I think that the pandemic has resulted in a number of drastic changes in our lives, and certainly drastic change for the Peace Corps itself.
Of course,
But
yes.
we won't get ahead of the game.
Well, Nat, I want to say, Nat, that I'm happy to be with you. I'm always looking for opportunities to talk about the Peace Corps because the Peace Corps transformed my life, and it's a wonderful, iconic American institution.
I love the way you talk about it, especially, in retirement, when we tend to look back at things and sometimes more critically than effectively, But anyways, let me give our audience a brief bio of the gentleman in whose company I am now. You were born in Chicago South Side, and you studied at Chicago State, got your bachelor's degree in geography and education. You became a teacher, and later on you got your MBA at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. You joined the Peace Corps. I hear in 1967 after listening to President Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver, and I don't know if at that time they had that slogan about the Peace Corps, toughest job you'll ever love.
I think that was before that, but that's a great slogan. It's timeless.
Okay.
It's appropriate for the Peace Corps.
Right, and it goes without saying that they remind the volunteers of it when they say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know this would be so hard," but you love it. You love it. Anyways, upon your return, you served as coordinator of minority recruitment for the Peace Corps, which is significant because I don't know if I'm wrong, but at the very beginning. I don't think there were that many women, for example, in the Peace Corps. Were there?
Well, actually, Nat, that's a very important point. Do you want me to elaborate on that now, or you want me to wait for after the introduction?
Well, let me finish the introduction, because if we start getting into the meat and potatoes, we'll never finish with this. And it's so long. I've done a lot of pruning as it is, but there's just so much stuff I can't leave out. You served for 22 years in various executive positions at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. You joined the RTI. Here's another slogan, delivering the promise of science for global good.
Right, we do.
And that was in 2003 as VP, International Business Development. You were nominated by one Barack Obama to be director of the Peace Corps in 2009, and in the same year you were confirmed by the Senate. That's not an easy feat anytime.
Well, in those days it was a lot easier.
Oh, by unanimous acclamation, right? Anyways, you served in very difficult times for the Peace Corps, first as a volunteer, then as a director, but we won't get into those yet. In 2012 you returned to RTI International as executive VP for the International Development Group. If I'm not mistaken, you still remain with them as a senior advisor, emeritus, correct?
That's correct. That's right, man. Yeah.
Even in your retirement, man, you never quit. Anyways, you served on the Obama-Biden transition team. you're current, I believe you're still currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, correct?
I am, yes.
Okay. And in addition to numerous accolades, you hold honorary doctorates from American University, from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, from North Central College, St. Mary's College, and the UCLA Medal, which is awarded for exceptionally distinguished academic and professional achievement.
Oh, Nat, you've done your homework, Nat.
Hey, wow, there's half the interview right there. Anyways, let's begin at the beginning. You sure didn't pick an easy time to join the Peace Corps in 1967. I'm thinking here of the Vietnam War and things that were going on, and the fact that the Peace Corps was never viewed kindly by Nixon, and that following the U.S.'s engagement in the war, the Peace Corps felt, or at least some of the Peace Corps felt, that they needed some independence, and they took over the offices in Washington. I mean, it was not an easy time, Aaron. Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, so there I grew up in a working class family on South Side of Chicago. Okay. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. And people expected me to settle down, become a teacher, and have a normal life. Well, I had become intrigued about the Peace Corps by listening to hearing Sergeant Travers' speeches, and I heard a couple of Kennedy's speeches. I was still pretty young when Kennedy was president. But I decided this is something that I should look into. It sounded like something that would be structured, would give me a chance to learn something besides about the outside of the United States. And it turned out to be the adventure of a lifetime. I mean, it truly transformed my life. Everything that I've done, Nat, has emanated from the Peace Corps. My entire career, whether I've been in business, I've been in government, I've been in the nonprofit world, Peace Corps was the trigger for that. And the other thing about Peace Corps is that when I arrived out in California at the San Diego State College where I trained, I was in a group of about 80 or 90 people. I was the only Black person in the group. And I was wondering to myself those first couple of days, what have I parachuted myself into? And I quickly found out within a week or 2 weeks there that I was in the presence of some very special people. People who had self-selected to join in this wonderful enterprise called the Peace Corps, who were interested about making the world a better place, and who were open to ideas, to people, to thoughts and philosophies that was just amazing. So it was an amazing time, and I trained with some amazing people. Part of our group went to El Salvador, part went to Honduras, the other part went to the Dominican Republic, and we were teacher trainers. So that's how it all emanated. That's how I ended up in the Peace Corps.
You grew up within a family of modest means in the South Side. What made you look outward? Because
I really don't know. It's always a great question. I'm really happy that I made that decision. As I often tell my wife and my children, boy, what a great decision I made, because I ended up with you. Because of the Peace Corps. My wife is from the Dominican Republic. I met her when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. But anyway.
Tell me how that happened. Because you see, that's one of the things we're not getting in the documentary. When I say the personal stories, and it is significant. It certainly was significant to your life.
Oh, that's no doubt about it. Well, the short story is this. I was a teacher trainer in a small town in the Dominican Republic, and we needed to have counterparts who were Dominican teachers who were experienced teachers. And I tried to convince this young woman, Rosa, who was a master teacher in this town, to join us. And she was opposed to joining this group because, as you might remember, the Peace Corps, the U.S. government had invaded the Dominican Republic a few years before I arrived there.
Okay.
So it was hard, it was tough, but Peace Corps had an impeccable reputation in the Dominican Republic because they understood the battle for a new democratic Dominican Republic. So even though she never did join us in that endeavor as a master teacher, I did end up getting to know her and eventually marrying her. So that's how I met her, trying to convince her to work with us.
So you couldn't convince her to work with you, but you
Right.
convinced her to
I
marry
took it to
you.
the next level.
and
Thank God.
how
So
long?
we've been married for 50 years.
Oh my gosh, you know. Has she ever reflected back on that original offer to join
Oh,
your group?
yeah, and she's adamant that it was the right decision not to join us.
It never changes, you know.
Right.
Try and change your mind, right?
Right. But, you know, that of course, you know, and so we've served together in the Foreign Service and business. You know, we've had an amazing life, lived in many, many different countries, raised our children in overseas and in the United States. So it's been a marvelous life. And Peace Corps led me down that road.
Yeah, you know, like you said, everything that you've done can be traced back to the Corps. But tell me, how were you not affected then by those turbulent years since you were in the Dominican Republic and you were overseas? Did you not feel like the waves of change flowing around the Corps back home?
Oh, we did, because this is the middle of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. I was overseas serving as a Peace Corps volunteer when Martin Luther King was assassinated and when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So these were tough times, and I often had to search within my own soul and heart as to whether or not I was going to continue to serve and in the Peace Corps during these periods of time. And it just seemed to me that it was the right thing to do. And I felt like I was doing and making a contribution to the Dominicans that I was working with, who were marvelous people, counterparts, friends. And so it was tough because those were turbulent times, but I managed to stay the course, and I stayed there actually for 3 years.
I'm glad to hear that was your opinion, because in the documentary they mention, other volunteers mentioned how they were able to flip the mindset of the United States when it was an occupying army, at the same time that they were there as friends.
That's right.
And
yeah, that's very well in the documentary. That's right. So it's a great story.
And because there were dicey times, but there's this marvelous story about, I forget the country, you probably remember better than I do, but where there was a famine and the US was an occupying force, and they reached the Agency for International Development and were able to access a warehouse, and they came in with these big trucks filled with rice and beans and what have you. And, the people were beside themselves. They didn't believe that these were the terrible American invaders coming to save them from famine.
Yeah. Well, the lovely thing about the Peace Corps is that you get to walk in somebody else's shoes. You get to understand the culture. You learn the language. Sometimes many languages, depending on where you serve, if it's Africa or Asia. And people learn about the true face of America. Right? This is the average American who's come to live with you, work in your organization, live in your village, and live in your neighborhood, and who empathizes with you and has deep respect for you and your traditions and your culture. It's the essence of humanity.
That's right.
You learn that in the Peace Corps, you practice that in the Peace Corps.
And the documentary certainly makes the case for that, but it only touches briefly on what it means to the volunteer himself. It talks about the effect that the volunteers have in their visiting country, but not in how it transforms them. Briefly they mention, well, and we got back home and life was never the same, because they were not the same.
They were not the same because they were changed. Well, I think, first of all, most of us who served in the Peace Corps, this is a common story that no matter what we did, no matter what program we worked in, whether it was education, teacher training, or teaching English as a second language, or working on HIV/AIDS, family planning, agriculture, whatever you happen to be involved in, and all of us usually are involved in youth development. Even though we perhaps made great contributions then, what happened to you as an individual was transformative, because you learned, because first of all, you learn a lot about yourself when you have to really step up and deal with adversity. You have to become resilient. And you find out what your limits are and how far you can go. The fact that maybe you don't have the limits that you had self-imposed before, right? Or what your background, culture, or family had given you in terms of your personal framework. So it's really an amazing trajectory. And I've seen that both in terms of my personal experience with the people that served with me in the Peace Corps, and also because I had the privilege to be director of the Peace Corps and see it again in the 21st century. It's a marvelous experience.
And also, it shows the American, and I think more importantly now than ever, perhaps, in the age of nationalism, that the world is not you, the world is not your neighborhood, the world is not the corner CVS or 7-Eleven. You know, there are people out there that are way different than you are, who have many different needs, perhaps far more urgent than yours, you know? And,
but there's also a great commonality. And that's what you really learn in the Peace Corps, right? You learn about the commonality, the things that we worry about, our children, the future, good health care, aspirations for our children and our family. And you learn that those are basic common elements that we all share, no matter where you might be born or live on the globe. Let me tell you a story.
Okay. Yeah. No.
So, I was in Ghana to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps. And I went to an event with the then Vice President of Ghana. And as we traveled, and he had been taught by a Peace Corps volunteer when he was a young man in elementary school in a remote part of Ghana. And Ghana was one of the first countries where Sergeant Schreiber established the Peace Corps in 1961. So when we arrived at this event, it was to celebrate the year of the teacher in Ghana. And a Peace Corps volunteer was one of the 10 top teachers that was being honored, as a matter of fact. And that Peace Corps volunteer, by the way, her parents had served as Peace Corps volunteers in Latin America, you know, years before. So what a marvelous, you know, a confluence of events. So as I was waiting in the government house in this regional city to go out to the event with the Vice President, and I had a couple of talking points I wanted to share with him about the future of the Peace Corps in Ghana and some things that the ambassador had asked me to share with the Vice President. And he wanted to tell me a story about how he met this Peace Corps volunteer. So he's a young man in this classroom. They had never seen a white person before in the village. And they were worried about this new teacher they had heard about. They wondered, would this man even speak English? Could they understand him? What was this going to be all about? He comes in and he says, how many people here in this room know how far the sun is from the earth? And they're thinking, why is he asking us this? Who knows the answer to this question? Everybody put their heads down. Nobody answered. He went up to the board and he wrote on the board, 93. Then he went around this one-room classroom with these walls and kept circling with chalk till he came back around to the front. He says, 93 million miles. Don't you ever forget that. And that's when this young man who became vice president and ultimately president of Ghana decided he wanted to become a scientist.
Oh my gosh. It's incredible. That's a beautiful story.
He could have told me anything that day, but that's the story that he shared with me, which I've never forgotten. It was such a stunning, amazing, and it tells you a lot about the impact of the Peace Corps. Now, last thing, epilogue. When I got back to the States, I did everything I could to see if we could find this volunteer who had taught him. And we did.
No kidding.
Since when he came over for a summit of African nations with President Obama, we arranged a reunion with the then vice president and the Peace Corps volunteer that taught him in Ghana in that rural school.
You're kidding. Were you there?
Yeah.
Was it very emotional?
No, I was not there.
Ah, okay. Okay, yeah. But I can imagine how what a beautiful moment that must have been for both of us.
It's a miracle to track him down. This is 50 years later. Anyway.
And, one thing that I have found remarkable, really, and it feels almost like divine intervention, but perhaps because Washington is so has become so politicized, but that an agent.
I had not noticed that.
You haven't lost your sense of humor. But how an agency that was born out of Kennedy's initiative, obviously a Democrat, has been successful enough, perhaps by drawing its volunteers, independent, on a bipartisan or independent basis, but and also how it has successfully managed to work both sides of the aisle and see its way through to obtain funding, to meet its needs in Congress, which may be impossible today, but has never been a cakewalk.
Well, I think that in answer to your question, I think that it started with Sergeant Schreiber. He did a magnificent job as the founder of the Peace Corps to move forward and develop bipartisan support for this new idea back, 50, almost 60 years ago. And I think all directors have really tried as best they possibly can to maintain that bipartisan support, and we have been successful. Because I think both parties see this as being something that gives young Americans a chance to serve and also reflects well upon the United States. And so, as a matter of fact, when I was director, there were 5 returned Peace Corps volunteers who were members of Congress. Senator Chris Dodd was there then, John Garamendi from California, Tom Petrie from Wisconsin, Mike Honda from California, and Sam Farr from California. They were all members of Congress and the Senate and the House. And they were avid supporters. They had a Peace Corps caucus, and it was bipartisan, and it was very important in terms of Peace Corps moving forward.
You mentioned Chris Dodd, and an aside, since we're in Miami, is that little clip in the documentary where Chris Dodd reminisces about the many times he met with Fidel Castro, and how Castro confided in him how hard he had tried over the years and was still trying to find some CIA connection to the Peace Corps, and had yet to come up with one.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that, first of all, that's just not an issue whatsoever. We've always promoted, peace and friendship around the world, and we're apolitical.
But I mean, the enemies of America have always looked at the Peace Corps skeptically, which is wonderful that it has been able to outlast all the skeptics.
That's right.
You were not greeted with open arms everywhere.
That's exactly right. Not at first, but if you think about the number of countries and hundreds of countries where we served, and the hundreds of thousands of people who have served as Peace Corps volunteers, we've had a lasting legacy, without a doubt. And it's made a difference. And many leaders of countries first experienced America by meeting Peace Corps volunteers, right? The former president of Peru, Alejandro Toledo, for example, his first encounter with Americans was through Peace Corps volunteers.
Huh. And also, when you mention bipartisan support, in Congress, you've had senators and members of the House of Representatives from both parties who are returned Peace Corps volunteers. Is that not so?
That's correct. We've had, I'm not sure what the total number is, but we've had, a large number, maybe a dozen or so who served. And right now there are, as I believe there are 3 members of Congress who are returned Peace Corps volunteers, including Donna Shalala, who of course is a congresswoman from your area, Joseph Kennedy III from Massachusetts, and John Garamendi from California.
Huh.
I believe those are the 3 who are currently serving.
Is Chris Shays still there? Because Chris Shays is a Republican.
No, he's no longer serving in the Congress, but he's a great friend of the Peace Corps, and he was always a great friend. And his wife, as a matter of fact, worked at the Peace Corps, as I recollect in the past.
Huh. Well, of course, and then Jimmy Carter, his mother,
Other
and his
right.
and his grandson.
And grandson, that's right. Jason served in the Peace Corps in South Africa. That's right. Yeah, I met Jason during the 50th anniversary. We did a couple of events together in Georgia. He had a marvelous career, marvelous time in the Peace Corps in South Africa.
You know, some of the political anecdotes are fascinating. You know, like everybody trembling. You know, what is Ronald Reagan gonna do? You know, and then he has this visit by the Prime Minister of Fiji, and the one thing right out of the Prime Minister's mouth is, "I want to thank you for the Peace Corps volunteers that have made such a difference in my country." And you can look at his face in the documentary, and it's like he's seen a ghost, you know.
It's a legendary story, and it's because of Lorette Rupe, of course, who was a magnificent director of the Peace Corps. And I think she's probably been the longest serving Peace Corps director. And she was a marvelous leader and really did amazing things as director of the Peace Corps. So it was fortuitous. That's right.
No, and she herself was looked upon with a great deal of skepticism because she had no work experience, certainly no international experience, and she had to really move about really carefully because a lot of people in Washington didn't want the Peace Corps around, and she couldn't be seen as supporting something that was not part of Reagan's agenda, in a way.
Well, she really turned that around, and she is revered in the Peace Corps community for the great contributions she made to making the Peace Corps the wonderful institution that it is today. She was truly a magnificent leader.
Well,
as a matter of fact, her daughter served in the Peace Corps subsequently, as I recall.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, you know, that level of advocacy by directors who preceded and followed you, because you were followed by Rupe, no?
No. Rupe was in the Reagan administration. So I was followed by Carrie Hessel Radley.
Ah, okay.
Who had been my deputy, and then she followed me after I left the Peace Corps.
But
and then the current director, of course, now is Jody Olson.
Okay, but there, yeah, I don't know if it's shared by all of you, but there's this advocacy that veers on the religious, the devotion for
certainly the converted.
Yes,
there's no doubt about that. You know, certainly in the case of myself, Carrie, and Jody, we're all former Peace Corps returned Peace Corps volunteers. And Jody, as a matter of fact, I think has probably more executive management experience in Peace Corps than anybody in Peace Corps' history. She's been a volunteer, a country director, a regional director, a chief of staff, acting deputy director, acting director, and now she's the director. So you couldn't ask for a more capable, committed person than Jody to be the leader of the Peace Corps today.
But tell us, how does someone as qualified as Jody manage to be appointed as director of the Peace Corps by one Donald Trump?
Well, I think that her appointment, you got bipartisan support. And, you know, she served in other Republican administrations, so her reputation stands on its own. So she was a logical choice. And I think that Peace Corps is very fortunate to have such a tremendous leader in place now.
Ah, okay. There is a great deal of concern, and the documentary does not address that because, of course, it was finished before the pandemic. But all of the Peace Corps volunteers have been evacuated and are back home in the U.S. Yeah. And there is great concern.
That's right.
About what's going to follow. You know, once we get through these bad times.
Mm-hmm.
What
this is, you know, this is something that's unprecedented. to return all volunteers worldwide back to the United States.
Yeah.
But of course, everything about the COVID-19 pandemic is first and unprecedented. But I think that the plan is for volunteers who wish to return, once those countries are opened up again, that they will have a chance to return. And Peace Corps continues to recruit for new cohorts of volunteers. So I think that, once things normalize, there'll be a chance for Peace Corps to resume its activities. Now, Peace Corps has not closed down its offices overseas. They're merely on pause while countries in the United States addresses the COVID-19 epidemic. That's my understanding.
Just before this happened, the documentary has maps and traces the progress up and down with the number of volunteers and what have you. Where were we before we had to bring the folks back home? In the history.
You mean in terms of where they regions they served in?
Where was the Peace Corps in terms of its accomplishments, its prestige, around the world at the time that the volunteers had to be called back home?
Well, I think it was in a very strong position because the Peace Corps brand and the volunteers committed to the countries that they serve and the organizations and the communities where they live. It's always been strong. It's always been very positive. Peace Corps volunteers are really well respected everywhere that we serve, and I think they were in good shape. And this was, of course, an upheaval that no one could have anticipated. And from what I've heard from a couple of stories of volunteers who returned back home since they had to be evacuated, is that their communities and organizations were very sad to see them leave and would hope that they would return.
Yeah, it'll probably be a gradual process, and like you said, this is even novel for the Peace Corps, because the Peace Corps has been through at least a couple of recent epidemics. It went through the Ebola crisis,
right? Yeah.
And it went through the HIV.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, Peace Corps, after that, volunteers work in HIV prevention and awareness. They work in Ebola prevention and awareness. So they're always on the front lines, right? And what better representatives of America, because they know the culture, they speak the language, and they know how to get things done in a different environment.
Yeah. It's funny that you should mention, we've talked about Lorette Miller Rupe, and talked about Jimmy Carter, about members of different families, Joe Kennedy, that have been members of the Peace Corps, but people don't know how ingrained it is with people all around them, and how many people of note really have served and really love the experience that they had in the Peace Corps.
It's wide-ranging people: senators, congressmen, global business people, people from the arts, the theater, almost every endeavor. We've even had an astronaut. So it's amazing what people do when they return home. They bring this rich cultural experience back, right? This cultural dexterity and agility, and it makes America a better place, a place that's open to the rest of the world. They become global citizens now.
Huh? Are you the first, or I don't know if you are the first, but is the experience you had meeting the woman of your life while you were in the call of duty a common experience while you're in service?
Well, it's interesting. I think it depends. If you look back at my generation, I think it was not an uncommon experience, because you had young men and women overseas at the time when they probably were going to get married. And so it was not uncommon. I'm not sure, what the trends are now, but certainly in the baby boomer generation served in the Peace Corps, it was not uncommon. I can think of half a dozen of my friends and my network who married people from the countries where they served.
My gosh. And also amongst themselves as well, or not as much?
Oh yeah, of course, and probably even more so, even more so. At the time, not many people went into the Peace Corps married. There were some married couples, but that was not the predominant situation. And I'd say that certainly people found their spouse in the Peace Corps, whether it's from the country where they lived and worked or somebody they served with. That's not an uncommon experience, as you would expect. It's like it's like going to school, going to college.
Right. Yeah. You have you meet your girlfriend in school or in college. Yeah.
And the beauty, as a matter of fact, Nat, I'll share with you a little secret. My son met his wife, my daughter-in-law, in the Peace Corps. I was the first serving director to have one of their children serve in the Peace Corps during my tenure. My son Stephen served in Nicaragua as a business volunteer, and he met his wife Na, who was also serving in the same group with him.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we're truly a Peace Corps family.
That's great.
One of the greatest things of our lives is for Rosa and I to be able to see Stephen join the Peace Corps, serve, and then meet his wife. Wonderful.
And your experience at the Corps extends beyond education, because I mean, you graduated from college, you were a high school teacher, but as the years wore on, your reach broadened. I mean, you're Mr. International Development. I can't think of a single major international development agency that has not been graced by your stewardship.
Well, you are very generous. It's very gracious of you. I've been privileged to have a chance to have this experience because the Peace Corps opened that door for me. Secondly, I've always been surrounded by tremendous friends, colleagues, mentors, people who have given me the opportunity to serve and to work on interesting projects and initiatives. And the fact that I had a chance as a former Peace Corps volunteer to actually end up serving as director of the Peace Corps was an extraordinary experience that you can well imagine.
Was it during that time that you were in charge of funding for South Africa under Mandela? Was it while you were director?
Yes, I was director during the Mandela administration in South Africa. I was not director. I was the head of USAID in South Africa during the Clinton administration when President Mandela had his administration in South Africa.
So you were there.
I became director during the Obama administration.
Right. And how was your experience working with Mandela?
Well, it's we need another 2 hours to talk about that. But let me say about President Mandela. President Mandela was everything that you have read and seen about him. And whatever you read or heard about him, it is absolutely true. He was a singularly extraordinary human being who comes out of prison after 20 decades of being in prison and decides to seek ways to transform his country, to seek reconciliation for all races in South Africa and lead to that democratic transformation. That is an extraordinary thing for any human being to do, especially someone who has suffered imprisonment for decades.
Yeah.
And he was that man. He was a person who cared about everybody in South Africa. He set the path forward for that country. And how fortunate South Africa and the world, how fortunate we were to have Nelson Mandela to become that extraordinary leader that he was.
Did you have much contact with him personally? Did you get to know him?
I did. I saw him at official events, and also I had a chance to work with him personally on a couple of initiatives that were near and dear to his heart. So yeah, I did have a chance to interact with him quite frequently.
Are your memories, your fondest memories, not your memories of hard times, but your fondest memories at the Corps, are they with world leaders or with with individuals, with unknowns, with people, common people of the country.
I think it's both. I've been privileged and honored to be able to have experience with the average person who's trying to accomplish something in their community or for their nation, and also with world leaders. And I think that I've seen magnificent things being done by everybody, whether they're just an ordinary citizen trying to improve their community, to bring microfinance to their village, to try to create a clinic that's going to treat pregnant women in their village, to improve girls' education and literacy. People want to fight tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS or malaria. And I've seen leaders take courageous stances that were not politically popular in their countries in order to achieve the greater good and improve the human condition. So I've seen both, like the vice president in Ghana, like, of course, the extraordinary Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Tutu in South Africa, another amazing person who walked the same land with Nelson Mandela, who led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, and brought together people to change the trajectory of that country. So, it's been, my experience has been rich. It's been, I've had a chance to work with some marvelous people, and I've seen all sides of the human condition.
And your faith.
I have remained optimistic throughout this journey.
That's what I was going to say. Your faith in it all remains unshaken.
That's true, because I've seen people who faced up to tremendous hardship and challenges and come out on the other side better for it, and the people around them better for it, and their societies have been improved for it. So, but it's not easy, and it takes determination, and it also is a matter of timing and who's in place and the kind of teams that you put together and the kind of leaders that you turn to. But I've also learned that in my experience that one of the number one skills that one has to have as a leader, especially in leading diverse teams and diverse cultures and nations, is the ability to listen and to understand the point of view of the other person that you're dealing with. And that way you can create meaningful, effective partnerships with just about anybody.
But even in these difficult nationalistic days, and I'm not talking, simply about the U.S., but it's something that we have seen in other countries, that is a troubling concern. You still feel that the goodwill of men will prevail.
I think so, and I think the Peace Corps is really my foundation for believing that, because I've seen people prevail against really tough horrendous conditions, right? Fighting disease, fighting poverty, political unrest, civil war, and they come out on the other side, in most cases, better than they were in the beginning. Not in all cases, right? But it happens. And so that's the reason why I continue to be optimistic about the future of the world, mankind. And I'm so proud of Peace Corps volunteers who have served for the almost 60 years in countries around the world to present the true face of America and to really understand what it means to be engaged with the rest of the world and to become effective and optimistic global citizens. That's what we bring to the rich tapestry of America when we return home, and what we do in our future careers here at home.
And Aaron, I will get scolded if I neglect South Florida, which is where we're at, if I, don't ask you about the Peace Corps and in our community. Do you have any particular people that you want to mention? I know you mentioned the Senator Donna Shalala. Have you had any other experiences here in South Florida?
Well, when I was director, Donna Shalala was then president of the University of Miami, and I think in association with the South Florida Association of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers, we had a wonderful event at the University of Miami. Also, at the Knight Foundation, we were hosted by Alberto Albergan, and he's also a returned Peace Corps volunteer. So you have two leading lights of the Return Peace Corps volunteer community in your community at the Knight Foundation at the University of Miami, and now Congresswoman Donna Shalala.
That's terrific.
I'm sure I'm missing somebody really important that I should know, but those are the two that come to mind right now.
Don't worry, Aaron. You'll probably hear from them as soon as we're through.
Someone who's going to watch the film. That's right. They'll say, "How about me, Director Williams?
Yes.
You met me."
But Aaron, I want to thank you. We just went dark for a second, and a sign flashed that says I'm running out of power. We could stay here talking for hours, but I want to thank you and to reemphasize that I look forward to meeting you in person shortly. The minute this thing is over, is behind us, you know, and that we're honored and grateful that we have people of your dedication looking after the fate of America and Americans, not only at home, but opening windows to the outside world, which is so important for others to see.
Well, Nat, thank you. You're very gracious. I appreciate that. You've been far too generous in your praise, but also I've always considered myself to be fortunate to be one of the members of this wonderful core of people of Return Peace Corps volunteers, people who have served and have seen the world from a different perspective, right? And have been able to present the true face of America to around the world. So it's a privilege. And whenever I travel with the former volunteers I meet, we always have, as kindred spirits, some connection, right? It's a wonderful club to be part of.
There you go. Well, again, I hope we meet in person soon.
We will.
I know it will be in 2020, probably before there is a vaccine.
We'll see each other. You take good care of yourself.
Thank you. Likewise.
And I'm so happy that you're going to be able to show the documentary in Miami. That's wonderful.
I know everyone is looking forward to see it. As I said, I'm grateful to the Association of Return Peace Corps Volunteers and to the director, Alana DeJoseph, who's been very active with writing to my associate, make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's, which we have. And this is an unexpected surprise. Nobody thought I was going to pull you out of the hat.
Well, let me say that, Alana, I have to say Alana deserves a lot of credit because this was obviously a labor of love as a former volunteer. And she served in Mali, and it really is a wonderful documentary about the Peace Corps and what the Peace Corps stands for. So we're all grateful that she was able to accomplish this on behalf of the community, on behalf of America. So
yes, I second that emotion. Again, Aaron, all the best, and we'll be seeing each other very soon.
Very good. Thank you, Nat. Thank you, Javier. Take care.
Bye.